Okay, hi everybody, welcome. So our continuing journey through tests and measurements, we will continue with chapter 9. So let me call up my screen and let us proceed. Alrighty, gang. So with chapter 9, we're continuing to examine the assessment, the evaluation of mental abilities. But here, instead of an individual test like the WACE or the Stanford Binet, we are going to be looking at group tests of cognitive abilities. In particular, we're going to spend a bit of time looking at the tests that are administered through grade school, but also the ones we are particularly familiar with, the SAT, some the ACT, and for some of you, the GRE. All righty. Now, as I've mentioned before, but I really want to kind of nail down this point, yeah, that in contrast to the WACE and Stanford Binet, yeah, the tests we're going to be talking about today are not IQ tests, all righty, but they are tests of mental ability, right? Your mental muscle, what you're capable of, how far you can go, yeah, and that's the weight that's attributed to these tests by both those who administer it, who get the scores, and certainly by those who take these tests, the examinees, us, right? So people often experience these tests as measures of their IQ, right? And they are not IQ tests. That said, they are measures of mental ability, particularly in areas of verbal skills and mathematical skills and so on. So that's where it's constrained or limited to those kinds of abilities. Yeah, whereas the IQ captures all kinds of functions as we just described before. Okay, that said, things like the SAT and GRE certainly um, are experienced with a lot of stress and pressure because of what they represent. Yeah, measures of your mental muscle in terms of particular academic skills. Alrighty. Now, what do these tests have in common? Yeah, whether it's the test I just mentioned or the MCAT. Well, not so much. I'm sorry, scratch that. Not so much the MCAT. That's more of an achievement test. Yeah, but for the SAT, PSAT, the ACT, GRE, and so on. Yeah, they share a lot of characteristics in common. Okay, first of all, they can be administered to a large group. Yeah, they tend to be, as you may recall, multiple choice in nature and let me just straighten the screen here, multiple choice in nature. And so because of that, you can administer it to 100 people in a large room or to tens and thousands of people on the same day across the nation. Okay. Because of that, there are almost always multiple choice in nature. Yeah, usually four choices, A through D as in Delta. Okay. But because of that, there are limitations in terms of what the group administered tests of mental ability can measure. Okay. Because there are multiple choice, there are a number of tasks that you can't assess, a number of tasks you can't do, and ergo a lot of abilities you can't measure. Yeah. For example, because the multiple choice, you can't measure things such as short-term memory. Yeah, which requires the examiner to read off certain items and the examinee to recall them, with the examiner scoring what's remembered accurately. Yeah. You can't do that with a multiple choice, right? Because all you're doing is sitting there without the advantage of an examiner, right, being able to question you like I just described. You also can't have a lot of tasks where you manipulate objects such as the blocks designs that we discussed in the previous chapter, chapter 8, and or puzzles. Similarly, as we discussed in chapter 8, yeah, which are part and parcel of the tasks that go to visual spatial abilities. Alrighty. Now, also unlike the IQ test, right, the group test of mental abilities tend to have a fixed time limit with a fixed number of items. Yeah, so it's very much more structured that way. Whereas, as you may recall, with our discussion about the WACE, yeah, some tests have time limits, others aren't, which allows you to measure different things. Yeah, different characteristics in problem solving and so on. And also allows you to determine where you'll finish with the task, right? Because with the SAT, for example, you're given so many, about 20-ish, I think, right? Well, we'll talk about it a little later, but there are different subtests. And for each subtest, there are usually two, um, um, I guess you can say, attempts, right? So for math, you have two, that's one subtest area, but then there are two times you go through that. And I think each time there are two groups of tests. And so each group is about 20 items. Same thing with verbal. Yeah. It's about, so that's a sub area, but then you're given it two tests, right? So you're given one group, which is about 20-ish items, and then another group of test items, which is about 20-ish. Alrighty. Now, in the end, these group tests of mental ability also provide a total score as well as sub-scores, right? You get verbal and math and so on. All right. The other strength beneath these tests are that they have a really strong research basis. Alrighty, because they collect tons of data every year. They get tens, if not hundreds of thousands of subjects providing data as they take the SAT or GRE and so on, and it just accumulates over the years. Yeah, and ultimately the function of these tests, yeah, are to make predictions. Now with the IQ test, it may be used to make predictions. It certainly has been part of predictive validity studies, but for the most part, when people take an IQ test, yeah, as a general matter, they're usually taking it for clinical purposes to determine problems that may be related to school functioning or just general work, occupational functioning, and so on. Yeah, maybe part and parcel of a referral question regarding someone who's showing early signs of dementia, and so on, or learning disability. Yeah, so it's to get a sense of someone's functioning. Whereas here, with the group test of mental ability, the function of the test is to provide data to administrators, maybe more specifically and more accurately, to be correct, an admissions committee at a university. Yeah, so that it allows them to predict who's going to succeed or not succeed at their institution. Okay, let's look at the different types of group administered mental ability tests. The first is the Otis Lennon School Ability Test. Oh, by the way, the Otis Lennon is one type of school ability test. There are a couple others, but this is one of the more common ones. I don't know if it's the most common one, but among the most common ones. It's the multi-level test, which measures different levels for different age groups. Yeah, so you have for first grade, second grade, and so on, right? So you have this multi-level test, meaning a test that's established for different levels of grade school. Okay, it measures things such as verbal ability, word knowledge, reading comprehension, quantitative math ability, as well as figural reasoning. Yeah, so not just math, but in terms of your being able to visually, logically figure out problems. Yeah, kind of similar to some of the visual spatial tasks we had discussed with the WAIS. Okay. And once a student completes the test, right, the raw scores are converted to scaled scores, and the scaled score here is summed up in the school ability index. All righty, let's talk about the big one here, the SAT, yeah, which for American students, they generally have to take from most universities. Yeah, although that's starting to change with an increasing number of universities dropping the SAT. Yeah. But let's talk about the SAT as it's structured. All righty. It's essentially structured along two main parameters, verbal and math ability. Okay, there's also a total score traditionally, and then we'll get to how it changed recently, yeah, well, relatively recently, back in 2005. But traditionally, for decades, there was a verbal and math component, and then a total score. Okay. Now, the scale score system for the SAT is such that the mean performance on the SAT is 500 with a standard deviation of 100. Yeah, so meaning that most people, 68%, perform between 400 and 600. Yeah, and then you take it 2 or 3 standard deviations and so on, which results in a range, SAT score range between 200 to 800 for both verbal, yeah, that goes from 200 to 800, math, 200 to 800, and the same with not IQ, SAT score. All right, so that's what most people are familiar with. Yeah, you may recall having a verbal between somewhere in that range. Yeah, and people talking about their math being in a certain range, and then their total. Alrighty. Now, as I mentioned, there were revisions made, and really important revisions made based on what was important for college admissions committees to know about students. So revisions were made both on the verbal and the math, but also adding another component, a writing component. Yeah, so that admissions committees, but also students wouldn't be limited to just a multiple choice format. That they can actually demonstrate a really important ability, yeah, writing. So we have that as well now. Okay. So the first, now it's referred to as critical reading, but essentially it assesses verbal abilities, includes tasks such as sentence completions, reading comprehension, where you read a passage usually about 3 to 4 paragraphs. And then you ask various questions to see if you understood and you thought about the reading material. Yeah. Um, and it's usually not just asking you about facts, like do you remember? So it's not just a memory test, but whether you understood the whole point of the reading, some themes, arguments that were made, things that were implied by the author of the very brief article or extraction from an article. The other is mathematics. Yeah. Now you answer, there are 2 formats to answer. Before, it used to just be multiple choice. Yeah. So you get a math question and then you had 4 options. All righty. Now, as some people took the SAT may recall, you would think it's easy because it's multiple choice math, but it wasn't, right? They were cleverly crafted, not in a tricky way, but they were good math questions. And just because the 4 options were there didn't mean it was easy. But in order to allow an expansion of um, examinees' ability to express what they know, how they know it, there's also now what's referred to as a grid in a response item where they can actually write their answer. Yeah. So that the examiner can determine, okay, well, if you take them out of the 4 um, multiple choice options, how close would they have been? Yeah. And finally, the 3rd edition, as mentioned before, was a writing component. Yeah, so that students can show really important ability, the ability to express themselves. And in this test, there is a multiple choice component where you answer some questions related to writing, but the big change here was an essay component, yeah, where students can write their answer and then it's scored by at least 2 examiners. Okay, so other students in the US take what's referred to as the American College Test, or ACT. Now, the difference between the SAT and the ACT is that the ACT is more of an achievement test. It tends to measure more of what you learned actually in high school. So it has more achievement-related items that measure what you experienced and what you acquired in English, math, reading, the different sciences. I think there may be a geography component as well. And the scale score system, its scale score system has a mean of 20 with a standard deviation of 5. And for each of the 4 main ACT test sub areas, the range is from 1 to 36. Excuse me. Alrighty. The reliabilities for the ACT are pretty good in the 80s and 90s. Now, and if I didn't mention before, the reliabilities, it was up here, but I didn't mention it, for the SATs are pretty high in the 90s. That's another reason why they're still used, is that the data supporting its use are fairly strong. The validities tend to be weaker, yeah, modest if not low reliabilities, predictive validities, although consistently significant. Yeah, the reliabilities tend to be pretty high though in the 90s. Yeah, which kind of goes to the important thing to think about. Yeah, for those who will take the SAT, in that, you know, very often it's not uncommon for students when they first take the SAT, if they're not happy with it, to want to take it again. Okay. Now, there are some things to think about with this. Okay. Now, if the first time they took it, there was some extenuating circumstance that really impaired their performance. Yeah, like they were sick as a dog. They heard some horrible news, bad news that kind of distracted them that day. Or they really couldn't prepare for some, because of some kind of extenuating circumstance. Then, yeah, there's an argument to be made that, the examinee, because of personal factors, right, weren't able to demonstrate a score that was closer to their true score. Yeah, as you may remember, classic test theory. Okay. That said, though, in the absence of that, yeah, if you prepared relatively well, if there were no extenuating circumstances or that distracted you or may have impaired your performance that day, yeah, in other words, you're relatively prepared as you should have prepared, and you're feeling fine and so on. You're as focused as you would be for any test. That argues against you're taking it again. Yeah, and the reason why is because in the absence of extenuating circumstances, whatever you got for your SAT performance, if you take it again, the odds are your performance isn't going to be that different. I mean, it won't be, odds are it won't be the exact same score, but it may not be that much better, or it could actually be lower, yeah, depending on circumstances. But it won't be that much lower either, yeah, provided that the second time you take it is you're in the same kind of psychological or circumstances as you were in the first testing. And why? What allows Tsushima to be able to say that? Well, because the reliability data on the SATs are fairly high, so your score generally won't vary that much. Yeah, this kind of brings us back to the standard error of measurement. Yeah, how much can Johnny's score vary? Yeah, and as you may recall, part of that formula involved, taking into account reliability data. Yeah, and here with the reliabilities being so high, it won't vary that much. Okay, so that's something that someone probably needs to factor in. But of course, if there were particular circumstances that impaired performance, that may be reason to take it a second time. Okay, now, how much of a predictor are things such as the SATs and ACTs? Yeah, how good are these tests in terms of their predictive validity? Yeah, well, the data is supportive of using group tests of mental abilities. Yeah, for in terms of predicting first-year college performance, generally you have an R of 0.50. Yeah, a correlation of 0.50. Um, Interesting enough, though, high school record, you're right, what your GPA was in high school and first year college performance is also correlated about 0.5, which kind of begs that question. Yeah. So why do we do the SAT? Why not just rely on the high school record? Why subject tens, if not hundreds of thousands of students every year to take this, to shell out money, to take up time, all that kind of stuff? Well, we'll talk about that in our debate or in our discussions about group test of mental ability, or whether we should still use the SAT and GRE. Yeah, there are a lot of arguments both ways. All righty. So let's spend a little time talking about the GRE. All righty. Much like the SAT, well, just like the SAT, it's a group test of mental ability. But like the SAT, it's structured very similarly. Yeah, in that you have a verbal component, a quantitative reasoning component, and an analytical component. Alrighty. With verbal reasoning, you have tasks that require you to determine how words are similar or the opposite of words that are presented. So you have to select words that are similar to, or think about how they're different from the words that are presented in a question. There's a reading comprehension component. And those are the main kind of verbal reasoning. So word knowledge, words that are the opposite of the words that are presented, words thinking in terms of the appropriate words given the context, right? So you're often presented a sentence and you need to fill in, and it'll have a space, and then you got to choose among a number of options, which is the best word that captures what's being expressed in a sentence. Yeah. And reading comprehension is similar to what I had described before with the SAT. Okay. With quantitative reasoning, what it measures is mathematical ability. Okay. It typically will utilize ideas or concepts from algebra and from geometry. Yeah. Not so much from calculus and, more advanced mathematics. But that said, right, algebra and geometry, college algebra and geometry is pretty complex. So for someone taking the GRE, if they didn't take, college geometry, actually, it's probably more like high school geometry. Um, Although I think technically speaking, it's college level algebra and geometry. But for the most part, I think if you took high school geometry, you're probably still in pretty decent shape. That said, if it's been like a year or two since you've taken algebra geometry, spend the time going through those topics because there are a lot of ideas from algebra and geometry that the test can measure. Okay, but unlike although it has that achievement component in the GRE, a lot of it actually gets into just good problem solving, mathematical problem solving. Yeah, so that's what's really kind of important to keep in mind with the GRE. Although it's important to be familiar with the algebra and geometry, it's not an algebra geometry test. Yeah, they'll have some items related to ideas in algebra and geometry, but the bulk of it is just to examine mathematical reasoning, yeah, and logical problem solving. And as with the SAT, there's a writing component, and there are two writing tasks that you have. One is a kind of debate format where you got to it's an argument format. You got to take a position and support that position. And the other is just a general narrative on a point or an issue. Okay. The scaled score system is similar to the SAT with a mean of 500 and standard deviation of 100 traditionally. Yeah, but now it has a revised scale score system with a range of 130 to 130 170. Yeah, and your raw score and its relationship to the scaled score depends on the particular year that you take it. Yeah, or no, I don't think it's even limited to the year. I think you're compared to the normative sample for the group. So if you took it in October and November, because there are certain set dates typically where you take it, where you're scheduled to take the test, and then around that time you're compared to that group of people who took it on or about that time, and your raw score will be and what it means will vary depending on what normative sample you're being compared against. Okay, so it's not like one normative sample that's used for decades. The reliabilities, just like with the SAT, are pretty good. They're up there in the 90s. Its predictive validity, interesting enough, undergraduate GPA is a better predictor than the 3 GRE subtests we just described. And it's about equal to the GRE total score. Yeah, if I didn't I don't think I specifically said, but with the GRE, right, you have those 3 subtests. So you have 3 subtest scale scores, but you have a total scaled score as well. And undergraduate GPA is about as equal to the GRE composite or total in predicting first-year graduate performance, which again kind of leads to that same question. Yeah, but we will discuss that at a later time. Yeah, undergraduate GPA in combination with the GRE general subtest usually predict better than either alone, and that's a fairly common finding in tests and measurements. Yeah, that if you got two good predictors, very often when you combine the two, the combined power, statistical power of the two variables taken into account, yeah, to make a prediction is usually superior than either alone. Usually, yeah, sometimes they'll be equivalent to using them separately. Okay, and another interesting finding now. Unlike the SAT, the GRE, right, you have this test of mental ability for graduate school performance, but you also have, besides the general GRE, you have what's referred to as subject GREs. In other words, GREs, different types of GREs that measure one's knowledge of different subject areas. And I think the common ones are psychology, English, biology, chemistry, physics, and math. There may be one I'm missing. Maybe history is another one. But those tests tend to are more achievement tests. Yeah, they're to measure what you learned. For example, the psych GRE measure things such as development, social psych, personality, your understanding of personality theory, statistics, research methods, stuff like that, abnormal psych, things like that, what you learned. So they're more achievement tests. And interesting enough, they are actually generally better predictors of first-year GPA in graduate school than the general GRE, which again gets back to that question, right? Why take the general GRE? But that's for another discussion. Okay, and with that, we also have, in terms of, and here's another example of a mental ability test, and it's a military and business, and for military and business purposes, but here for the military, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, or ASVAB. Yeah, it has 10 subtests, which measure 4 major abilities: verbal, quantitative, familiar stuff, technical ability, and speed. Yeah, which is kind of a interesting and kind of a cool component that they have that in the test as well, right? Mental speed, reaction time. Yeah, its total scaled scores, the AFQT, which is a combination of a number of subtests, which is often used to determine, rule-ins or rule-outs for the military. Reliability is a little lower, more in the 50s and 80s, yeah? But it depends on the number of items for each of the different subtests or 4 abilities, okay? And with that, I'm not gonna go through this, but that, didn't mean to get out of there. Okay, so kind of a final conclusion about group mental ability tests, right? The areas that tend to be measured are verbal, reading, and quantitative. Reliability is generally in the 90s, yeah? Just keep in mind the issue about retaking a group mental ability test, and the predictive validity, so it can really range, right? From as high in the 60s for some, typically in the 50s for the SAT and GREs, and or it could be as low as in the 30s or sometimes even in the 20s. Although low, consistently significant. Yeah. And with that, that's all I have to say about group tests of mental ability, and that's all I have to say about Chapter 9. And with that, I'll see you when we talk about Chapter 10. All right? Have a good one. And thanks for your attention. Bye-bye.